Okay, I will go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics Seminar, the TREATS Seminar. This Today we have Dr. Halverson speaking to us about vertebrates and invertebrates in research, um, talking about research ethics with animals and extending that to a often overlooked clade. Not clade, is it a family? Is it a family? Is it a genus? What is invertebrates? Is it a kingdom?
I think it's a bunch of different phyla, but I think you can say clade too.
An overlooked clade. And I'm thrilled to have you all here. As you all know, Treats Talks try to introduce the key ethics issues, especially for non-experts in ethics and research regulation, and to guide people. These talks are then recorded and available on the IU Center for Bioethics website. Colin is an assistant professor in the Division of General Internal Medicine and Geriatrics in the Department of Medicine at the IU School of Medicine. Most importantly, he's a faculty investigator at the IU Center for Bioethics and one of our faculty on the bioethics program for the Indiana CTSI. Um, and I will stop there instead of trying to explain all of Colin's wonderful accomplishments and qualities. So I will, though, at that point, hand it over to Colin just to tell us about this important topic. Thanks, Colin.
Sure, thank you, Dr. Schwartz. So I will say immediately I recognize that no, invertebrates don't constitute a clade, because because then it would also include vertebrates. So
Did you
uh,
just search it up? Is that what you did?
no,
I've got to search it. I'm going to find out this
yeah,
biological right now.
I don't think it's a coherent group of animals. It's just in opposition to vertebrates. Uh, But anyway, it does
All
mean that they don't. I mean, I guess anatomically, it's a coherent group in the sense that they don't have backbones or notochords. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Every year, I lecture to my medical students about the ethics of working with animals in research settings. Many, in fact, most of them do not conduct such research themselves, but there's still a lot to learn about the debates in this field. As a short preamble to my talk, I want everyone listening to take this not just as an opportunity to think about animals, but to think with them. In reflecting on our moral intuitions about what obligations we do or do not feel toward non-human subjects, I want to consider where morally relevant differences arise and what characteristics that subjects, human and non-human, must possess in order to be the source of such obligations. More practically, I'll describe the legal and policy infrastructures that have been growing around animal research in the West for the last century or so. Regulations in the US and internationally have traditionally drawn a hard line in the ethical sand between the use of vertebrate and invertebrate animals in everything from food production to product testing. Medical research has been no different, but recent discoveries about octopus cognition and hermit crab pain tolerance, among many other things, reveal a much blurrier boundary. Today, we'll discuss the ethics debates around that boundary as a way to better understand the moral status of non-humans in general in medical research today, as well as a way of better understanding where moral obligations come from and why they're seen to apply differentially to different types of individual and individual organism. I don't have any relevant disclosures for today's talk, but I will say that I spent about an hour this morning chasing around a little dog up and down our street who has gotten loose from someone's backyard, who sadly told us she does not want the dog back. And so then I spent some more time trying to rehouse her. She does have a new home. Her name is Hayes. She's very cute. So I've had animals on my mind all day today, and happy ending for Hayes, especially since it's going to be 100 plus degrees heat index today. All right, so,
Animals and our ethical obligations and opportunities with them. What a wonderful
so
story.
that is my disclosure. You can already see what I think about moral obligations to some animals, at least. Um, All right, so quick outline for today's talk. I want to start with a history of animal ethics in the US as a way of thinking about why we feel like we need regulations on the use of animals in research. Then we'll look at the emergence of some of those regulations. Then I'll turn to a debate in ethics about where those obligations come from and to what extent they apply, and to what and why they apply. And then finally, I'll close with practical guidance for everyone who's doing actual animal research to discuss how to possibly do it as ethically as possible. I do have some prompts for conversation at the end if we have time during the Q&A. Otherwise, I'm happy to have a regular question and answer session and field those as best I can. So this is very much the history of animals in the West. We have a relatively short history of deep philosophical and legal thinking about animals on this side of the world. If we looked at this history somewhere else, for instance, especially in India, you'd find instead of a couple centuries, a couple millennia of really rigorous philosophical thought about our relationship and moral obligations to non-human animals. But for biomedicine, as it's like traditionally conceived, the story really begins in 1876 in the United Kingdom, when the Cruelty to Animals Act was passed. Interestingly, even though cruelty is in the name, primary motivation for the passage of this act was not so much a concern about the welfare of the animals, but because the Victorian women who lived in houses around kind of the domestic laboratories of scientists could hear the howling and wailing of animals who were having experimentation done on them. So a lot of this actually was motivated by a concern for the decorum of neighborhoods more so than, or alongside the welfare of the actual animals. This isn't particularly surprising if we think back to one very common thread of attitudes towards animals from the time that I think, classically has been represented by the Enlightenment philosopher Rene Descartes, who famously described animals as automata, even pet dogs, and was known for vivisecting these animals, so conducting live dissections. And when the dogs would howl, he dismissed this as an index of an internal state and said rather that it was, quote, the sound of a machine functioning improperly, no different from a whining gear that needs oil. This perspective enabled what today we consider abuses in a lot of animal-based research. In the 1950s and 60s, this really started to get recognition in the United States. There was the famous case of pets that were being kidnapped for medical experimentation to be sold in that way. Pepper the Dalmatian is a famous example of this. She was used in, I think, cardiovascular research and then died, with the owners never being able to find her. Other very famous cases are, for instance, Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, who conducted electric shock experiments with dogs and discovered through that research what he later called learned helplessness, which for quite a while was a real key pin in a lot of psychological research. Seligman went on to work with the CIA using techniques he had developed with dogs to inform what at the time were called enhanced interrogation techniques, which President Obama later recharacterized as, quote, we tortured some folks. Harry Harlow is another example from around the same period who was working in Wisconsin on isolation experiments with baby monkeys. You can see one of these images on the screen right now. He was particularly cavalier in his language describing his research. He talked about his instrumentation as pits of despair, described his research topic as emotional anorexia, and even characterized his methods as sadistic. I think both of these cases are really interesting because they underscore the kind of slippery line between attitudes towards non-human and human animals, where there's a recognition on the human side of the divide that these types of behaviors would be immoral or bad acts. But on the animal side of the line, non-human side of the line, you see different attitudes, but also even in just the language that's used to describe them, you see that there is this extension of moral concern, even if it's being dismissed. So then, kind of in response, around the same time as Seligman and Harlow, the United States passed its first Federal Animal Welfare Act, nearly a century after the UK's similar law. Interestingly, and especially for this talk, the legal definition of animal in this act excludes all invertebrates, so animals like cephalopods, as well as some vertebrate individuals bred specifically for research rather than gathered in the wild. And also, I'm pretty sure it excludes all animals, all mice from the genus Moose, and all rats from the genus Rattus, because again, these were such prolific animals already at that point in medical research. And that was the very beginning of the modern regime of oversight of animal research in the US. Even that early on, especially with invertebrate animals, it wasn't always the case that these regulations were in response to moral concerns, though. All invertebrate regulations up until quite recently were solely based on concerns about these animals as biohazards. So appropriate handling was determined based on the specific gene mutations, the potential that an animal was toxic or poisonous, or that it could be invasive and dangerous to the environment. This is in large part due to the fact that even while any pet owners who might be listening probably have pretty anthropomorphic attitudes towards their dogs or cats, in the scientific realm, robust descriptions of higher cognitive behaviors weren't described until really the last century. For instance, tool use was first described by Jane Goodall in 1960 when she observed chimpanzees in the wild fishing for ants using sticks. And then in 2007, it was also shown that these chimps could not only use ready-made objects that they found in their environments, but also sharpen these sticks into spears that they used kind of ominously in hunting these small, very cute primates called bush babies. Then moving very far away on the evolutionary tree from humans in the 2011, actually, even, Alex Koselnik first demonstrated that New Caledonian crows could not only use tools in experimental settings, but modify tools based on novel tasks that they were set in front of. Then also in the pandemic, I don't know if any of you guys watched this, but I think a lot of tool use in animals became very popularized by the film My Octopus Teacher, where you see an invertebrate using tools. And since then, we also have learned that even something as cognitively simple with tiny little brains and very few neurons like a bee can demonstrate associative learning. And I don't have time to show this, but if you're interested, you can go on to YouTube and see videos of bees using something that could arguably be called tools. So then in the 1980s, the animal liberation movement really began in the United States with the foundation of the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, and in direct response to their advocacy, you saw the passage of the Public Health Service Policy on Humane Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. Rolls off the tongue. It's more commonly called the NIH policy or PHS policy because it's been adopted quite widely. And this is the reason that we're required to have institutional animal care and use committees, or IACUCs. So it's kind of the non-human equivalent of an IRB. Importantly, though, for this talk, IACUCs still do not require that protocols related to invertebrate research in most cases, so with animals such as snails, C. elegans, flies, many other insects, does not require that they be submitted to the IUCB for review. Um, and also in a less kind of formal setting, every year I ask my students about these types of topics too, and they consistently poll that fewer regulations are needed for using invertebrates in research than vertebrates. Last year, it was even 85% said fewer versus 40% said fewer for animals overall. Um, then back to kind of the evolution of these policies. In 2015, the NIH announced that it would no longer financially support chimpanzee-based research. And the same year, there was an international consortium that published very famous guidelines in Europe for the care and welfare of cephalopods, so animals like octopuses. Then in 2021, there was a review by the London School of Economics that again shifted policy mainly in Europe, not in the US, that provided recommendations for the use of cephalopods, again, like octopuses, and decapod crustaceans, so things like crabs and lobsters. The NIH 2 years ago, this is the most recent update for us in the US, released a request for information from its laboratory animal welfare office, um, asking for submissions on cephalopod guidance on practice standards. This was in recognition to a lot of the research that was being done and used in Europe, demonstrating that octopuses and others can experience pain and exhibit, quote, mammalian-like responses to anesthetics. The US still lags behind places like the EU, UK, Switzerland, Norway, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in having much more robust research oversight for invertebrates. This brings us to the ethical debates. Again, I want to stress that I think the reason that this is so interesting, not just for people who actively work with animals, but in thinking critically about how we behave towards animals, we can get at a better understanding of our moral intuitions more generally, including those towards non-human or towards human subjects. In order to start unpacking these ethics debates, I want to differentiate two, I think, critical concepts. One is called moral standing, and one is moral status. These two things are pretty different. Standing is kind of the same as the legal language jurisdiction. So the idea that an animal can have moral obligations, can be the source of moral obligations in the first place. This is different from saying that an animal has moral status, which is a differential entitlement to specific treatment. So an animal could have much higher moral status than another. So saying that an animal has moral status, like, does not mean that it has equal or more rights than a human. You can also say that, for instance, a chimp might have higher moral status than a mouse might have higher moral status than a nematode. The way that both moral philosophers and animal rights activists talk about the reasons that we do or don't have specific obligations towards non-human animals typically comes from the demonstration of empirical characteristics of those animals. The bedrock of all this, the most fundamental feature, is called sentience or consciousness. This is generally seen as a prerequisite for any individual having moral standing. And by consciousness or by sentience, what's meant is that there's something that it's like to be that individual. This is famously discussed by philosopher Thomas Nagel, who describes whether there's something that it's like to be a bat, concluding, yes, there is. I think for many of us on this Zoom call, you probably can think of plenty of animals that you could imagine there's something that it's like if you were that animal. But it gets a little bit more complicated. Again, the further that you get from the human node on the tree of life. So is there something, for instance, from your perspective, that it's like to be a gnat instead of a bat? Then moving from this kind of basic moral standing to thinking, how do we differentiate the types of entitlements that animals may or may not have? For many philosophers, the next step is to consider not just whether the animal is conscious, but whether it possesses valenced conscious states. So whether it can experience pain and pleasure, for instance. Again, I think there are some things that might immediately come to mind for this. So I always ask my students, how do you know if your patient experiences pain? And the first answer, obviously, is, well, they'll tell you. Obviously, you don't always believe whether your patient's in pain or not, but the gold standard is that self description of the pain. Um, that obviously is a clear boundary between human and non-human animals where we can't communicate in the same way with them. But when I ask, how do you know if your dog's in pain? People, again, can identify specific behaviors. So dogs can whimper. That is a way of verbal communication, but they also describe things like the dog holds its paw a certain way, it limps, it might behave kind of unusually, like go and hide by itself. Uh, Also, again, kind of like getting further and further away from the human node. I always have, it seems like one student who has a pet tortoise or turtle. And this is a lot trickier. And they often talk about how at first they couldn't tell whether their pet turtle had could experience pain or not. But as they spend more time with the animal, they start to recognize certain behaviors and signs also as indices of these private internal states. So even if a turtle has a pretty mute face and not capable of making expressions that you would be able to readily interpret, they might notice a different kind of pallor, again, more languor, disinterest in food, all of these things that then come to stand to these pet owners as signs of um, internal distress. Um, that obviously is not the most scientific way of determining whether an animal feels pain or not, but you can see these moral intuitions are already emerging. On a more scientific side, a general way that people look at this is to try to find homologous structures and homologous chemistries. But you can see here, I've got an example on the top of a cephalopod brain of an octopus brain versus a human brain. They look very different. And this isn't even getting at the problem that octopuses also have a lot more distributed cognition in their limbs than we do. Uh, so then it becomes a question, can an octopus feel pain if it doesn't have the same structures that we associate with pain in the human brain? But it's challenging when you think that uh, even birds, which can perform, here you can see a crow using a tool, birds that can perform very complex cognitive tasks do not have a laminated forebrain at all. And virtually all higher executive functions are performed by non-homologous structures. Same thing with fish, which all higher brain functions are handled by these other structures. So just because an animal lacks those structures doesn't mean that it can't perform these tasks and doesn't mean that it can't experience pain. So this brings us to the final of the criteria that are generally deployed in determining what moral status an animal might have. This is cognition. Again, there are some pretty obvious, pretty common examples that you can think of. An elephant can recognize itself in a mirror. Great apes can communicate with symbols and gestures. But again, going back to the bee example, there's been a lot of work on bees showing that they can do associative learning, task switching, very complex symbolic interactions. So these are all the empirical criteria that are generally used, but we don't need to rely only on these empirical criteria. In bioethics, people regularly talk about dignity. The dignity of the patient is something that is separable and unrelated to the specific characteristics of their ability to experience pain or their cognition. Many people talk about the dignity of someone after brain death, uh, someone who is otherwise unconscious. And in other parts of the world, dignity is also a major way of thinking about human relationships with animals. So, for instance, in 2012, there was a survey in Japan that found that 95% of institutions conducting animal experimentation, so not just universities and medical centers, but also even private corporations, perform memorial services to appreciate, console, and comfort the spirits of the sacrificed animals. during the annual, quote, Be Kind to Animals Week in September. And in Cleveland, for the last 20 years, there's a Buddhist temple that's even held these types of memorial services and attended by primarily Japanese physicians at the Cleveland Clinic. Dignity is important because it separates the empirical questions about what gives rise to moral obligations. Not only does it suggest that we don't need to be able to demonstrate whether an animal can feel pain to be the source of moral obligations, but it can also be found in animals that have been demonstrated not to be able to show pain or not to be able to show higher levels of cognition. For the Japanese physicians, this is obviously still related to some kind of moral obligation to the animal. But even in our own Western philosophical tradition, we see that Kant very famously said, quote, he who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with men. And so in this train of thought, the source of the moral wrong is not so much the harm caused to the animal, but that in causing harm to the animal or in acting in a certain way towards the animal, it promotes these kinds of bad acts towards humans as well. Now for some practical guidance. The first and still, I think, fundamental way that people have tried to develop ethical algorithms in discussing animal research is the 3 Rs. These were developed in 1959 by 2 British zoologists. And I looked this up because I thought, oh, this is very similar to reduce, reuse, recycle, the sustainability mantra. But it actually seems to predate that. And so you heard it here first with animal ethics. For animal ethics, though, the 3 Rs are replace, reduce, and refine. By replace, it means, if at all possible, use non-animal subjects instead of animals. So you could think of using human-derived organoids instead of fruit flies, for instance. But also, a lot of people have taken this to mean that you should use animals with lower moral status than animals with higher moral status. So think of instead of using chimps, you could use mice. Instead of using mice, you could use cockroaches. Then you have reduce. And so this means cut back the number of animals that you're using. This is also really interesting because a gentleman from the IUCB discussed the problem of thinking about this only as cutting all the way back. So you actually don't want the smallest number of animals. You want the smallest number of animals that will still produce scientifically valid results. So if you imagine a study where it's initially proposed that you sacrifice, say, 50 pigs, you might think it'd be more moral to cut back and only sacrifice 10 pigs. But actually, if it's scientifically necessary to have that larger number, it actually means that in reducing too much, what you end up with is doing a moral injustice to 10 pigs whose deaths then go on to promote no medical science. Finally, we have refine. And this just means when you're thinking about your protocols, you should be thinking about making them to limit the distress and pain of the animal models that you're using to the greatest extent possible. So this could include something like adding an anesthetic for crustaceans before dissection, something like that. Then, because I'm an anthropologist by training, I also want to acknowledge that there have been in other parts of the world 2 other Rs suggested as 4th Rs. We've already seen in Japan these memorial services as a way of 4th R remembering the animals, so respecting their dignity. And in India, interestingly, this is even enshrined in a law that was from 1998. Rehabilitation. So if at all possible, instead of, as is common practice in the United States, sacrificing the animal at the end of an experiment, trying to adopt out that animal. If the animal has experienced harms, like physical harms, trying to help the animal recover. And so that is the 4th R. And you can see that there are very different ways in different parts of the world or with different ideological mindsets of thinking about your obligations to these animals. Some quick discussion about research design and reporting, and then we can turn, I know I'm just about at the half hour, so then we can turn to some prompts that I have and some Q&A. One critical thing to be aware of in designing research with animals are the USDA pain categories. These must be assigned to all research in advance. And they're not just, we shouldn't just think about this as a bureaucratic obligation, but this is a chance to reflect on and justify the level of pain and distress that the animals will experience as a part of your research. It's interesting, you see that there are categories B, C, D, and E here. There are only 4. There is no category A. I don't know the history of that. And then on the other side of the screen, you can see reporting guidelines. This is, as a lot of ethics, actually, this is kind of driven by the journals. So recently, the kind of most prominent one came out in 2020 in PLOS Bio. These are called the Arrive Essential 10 checklist. And so all research with animals requires that you report these things if you're submitting to a journal that uses this checklist. This is also required by many NIH publications and has gotten a lot broader in the journal landscape. Includes items such as a justification for sample size, like we discussed in the reduce of the 3 R's. I've got some emails for you too, if you have specific questions. The IUCB, so our animal version of the IRB. There's also, we have an Animal Research Protections Office, and I'm not the kind of touch person for this, but I'm very interested in it as an ethicist, and my email's up there as well. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of the case of animal ethics as it stands today in the US. I've got some prompts for reflection. So I don't know if Dr. Schwartz, you would like me to go through these, or if you want to turn immediately to Q&A, since we are a little bit over the half hour.
Why don't you let people ask questions, and then this is sort of here for the discussion. Do we have any questions at this point? There's a lot that you've presented, Colin. Terrific amount. I mean, I know this is one of your interests also, Colin, just let me just put a point on it. These are excellent questions that may lead there anyway, but right now, the animal regulations, I think the 3 R's, I think I didn't hear a criticism in there that it's a reasonable sort of theoretical structure for the obligation. And the IACUC oversight, again, I don't know if you have a critical perspective on that or if you're comfortable with it. I think you're probably comfortable with it. By the way, I was going to say the 3 R's though, before reduce, replace, and refine, and before reuse, whatever it is for like it's the 3 R's of education.
Oh, that's true.
Reading, writing, and arithmetic.
I
Only
didn't even think of
starts
that.
with an R. It's a balderized 3 R's. Yeah, I just thought of that as you said that. Um, but I guess okay, so do you want to say anything about that? Like I know also, like you said, invertebrates are left out of any oversight or control of the 3 R's don't apply to invertebrate research. Since you did put that in your title, I just think, are you recommending a change in the way we think of vertebrates, which by the way are a subphylum? I've confirmed this with some
Of Chordata, yeah.
audio speaking. But with the vertebrates or do you sort of think there's a move or think there's a ethical drive towards starting to oversee research within vertebrates, at least in some way, or like you said, your students aren't very supportive?
So yeah, I will respond. First, I do think the 3 R's, it's a great kind of baseline. I think especially for people in a medical field, having a very simple algorithm like that to get the kind of the thoughts flowing is great. I also think that the ICUC is really good. I know that they explicitly always try to have people who are not involved in research on the board so that you get perspectives that are not necessarily biased by people who have a more science-driven approach to animal welfare. But I do absolutely think that this is, like all fields in ethics, um, a changing terrain. I think we will well, I still believe that despite everything, that we will also move closer to the EU in a lot of the regulations for especially things like octopuses in use in research. But I think we'll probably see something similar in the near future with crabs and lobsters. And yeah, so I think we will necessarily be heading more in that direction. I think the exact same thing is going to happen with vertebrate animals as well. Uh, Probably even at a more rapid pace. I Legally, there's been some very fascinating stuff that's especially pushed by PETA and some other welfare groups that has moved towards greater consideration of ethical personhood of especially animals like whales and elephants. There have been some lawsuits even about those animals. And fascinatingly, a couple of years ago, there was a lawsuit about hippos that had escaped from a drug dealer's compound in South America somewhere. Uh, so yes, I think we'll also be seeing more acknowledgement of ethical standing for vertebrates as well. And I think we should too. I think that's the correct movement.
Yeah.
I see Nick's hand is up.
I just wanted to observe that we have a question in the chat, and then I'll have a question after.
Oh,
Chat.
great. Okay, so do you know if there are regulations for insect research? I was listening to a Canadian podcast a while back, and it made it seem like they didn't have any. Yes, there are no regulations. I think that there is actually some very interesting work being done here at IU on insect experiences of pain. I think that the probably official recommendation is no, you don't have to worry about using insects in research. I think that it probably would be useful still, ethically probably best practice to submit insect and invertebrate research protocols to the IACUC. I imagine that they would not uh, want to spend a lot of time reviewing those, but I do think it's a worthwhile moral practice in any case to start thinking through those things as if they would be reviewed. Then there's another text from Jane in the chat now, but Nick, I know that you had your hand up first, so do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I'm curious because you talked about the history of animal ethics in the West, that what's driving these changes? Do you see it as a top-down, we've uncovered new evidence and regulatory bodies are taking the lead, or do you see it as public bodies, activist groups like PETA and the Shrimp Welfare Project are pushing change from the outside in, or is it a combination of both?
No, I think it, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but it definitely seems that it would be the bottom up. It seems like a lot of this work is being done by welfare groups, and there's a lot of pushback at the federal and also even institutional level against adding more regulations. I think there's a real concern. I've got this as one of my reflection prompts here, that imposing too many regulations would chill science and slow progress. But I think that we've had lots of very parallel debates with human research. And I think there's strong reason to believe that there is not good moral justification for raising science, the value of science, abstractly above that of demonstrable welfare concerns. And then Jane. Okay, so Professor Hartsock writes, what do you see as the relationship between the ethics of animal research and the ethics of food production? It strikes me as odd that there is a complete disconnect between the way we treat, say, octopuses in research and the way they are treated at Kroger. Yes, absolutely. I think that's fascinating. And it is bizarre that there are, at the regulatory level, so many silos for the same animal, the same even individual animal born into different circumstances, is going to be regulated by different bodies, is going to be subject to different protections. And one thing that I think is great about medical research is, at the very least, there are a lot of these even minimal protections in place that you're not going to see in place at all in something like factory farming. I mean, obviously, the types of procedures that are done on, say, a chicken to or like a veal calf or something like that, you'd never be able to do with animals in a medical setting.
Okay, great. That's a great question, Jane. It sort of leads to what I want to say. I mean, I think well, I don't know which way your question goes, but the other side, devil's advocate. Here you go. I mean, the balance with animal research. This is a very calm talk. This is a very open and encouraging talk. And for those of us who've worked in laboratory medicine, the PETA attacks are just upsetting, because it's an advocacy. They're disrupting and taking a very firm and not usually a mainstream stance for science. I think scientists like the three R's are saying, I'm doing important work to advance human health. They're trying, and they're doing their best to keep the animal as comfortable as possible, even if animals are being killed, and being killed, if possible, painlessly. And then they feel under attack when people come in and say, you should not be doing dog research at all. And you're raising important questions, like what exactly makes a dog different from a human? Is it the nature of the pain, the nature of the sentience? What gives us the right to use dogs? Jane's question comes back to also say, well, then, is that also I mean, as it is for PETA, right? A question about how to use animals in general. So while you sort of painted a picture of sort of a ethical evolution of broadening the circle of ethical concern, I think as Peter Singer has described it, or it's not Peter Singer, it's the guy at MIT. It's blank on his name, Steve Pinker. That as time goes on, we broaden our ethical concern. First, it's just our own family, then it's our own tribe, then it's our own species, perhaps, then it's other species. It's an admirable progression, but it's also, how do you do science, well-meaning, perhaps well-conducted science, if you include, say, well, everything's ethical, but you didn't say this, but if you got to the point where you said, well, our ethical discrimination against other species is unacceptable. I don't know if you have a feeling about that, about this being an area of battle and incommensurable attitudes, and maybe even, right, incommensurable, unable to be on the same page with each other? Or is it really a reasonable conversation, or can we only hope for the reasonable conversation and we'll never get it? That's 15 different questions, a lot of just emoting here in public. It's a small group, so I'll emote like crazy. And I'll tell you the stories of my time in an animal lab and a mouse lab that partly helped move me away from doing science.
So I'll address at least two of those questions, I think, of the 15. I think that's a failing grade. But first, I'll say, kind of pulling back in Nick's comment about the grassroots nature of a lot of this. PETA, I know that they have very philosophically minded individuals, very academic people involved with them, but I think a lot of their strategy is political and rhetorical. And I think those things are increasingly conflated, especially in the American arena. And that's very different from what I've hopefully presented today, which is trying to think about the ethics of it. I don't think that anything that I've said suggests that there should be no experimentation on animals, just like I'm certainly not suggesting that there should be no experimentation on humans. Hopefully, what people can take away from this is that there is a way to do research where you take moral concern for the subjects of that research as a critical component of the protocol. And so that's really what I want to, I hope people have seen from the way that I've tried to describe this. Then in terms of the other question that I did manage to write down, Dr. Schwartz, about you said it wasn't Singer, you said it was Pinker. And yes, everyone loves Pinker. I'm an anthropologist, and as an anthropologist, I have to say the idea that your moral community starts with just your family. I mean, it's almost a Marxian attitude. Starts with your family and slowly moves out towards including maybe even at the very least conspecifics, maybe some individuals outside of your species, is certainly not what you see in the ethnographic record. I I like fundamentally disagree with that as a reasonable way of interpreting human nature. I think that's very much based on the kind of like weird society's notion of Pinker probably spends too much time talking to his students and probably no time talking to people in other parts of the world. Um, so yes, I very much disagree with the idea, and it's an interesting way that you've connected these two things, because it does suggest that this would not be a slippery slope. That if you think that there could be some moral status to an animal like Drosophila or a hermit crab, it does not mean that there's going to be this cascade effect where all of a sudden you've encompassed the statues in the temple and the waterfall and whatever as
I
moral.
want to register that I've been definitively put in my place, and I appreciate that, Jane.
Yeah, I'm gonna emote too, and we'll see where this goes as a question. And I like that better than the I have a comment more than a question. I'm just gonna emote. So as you all know, I have a kiddo with tetralogy of Fallot, and I'm acutely aware of the fact that they would not be alive but for dog research on dogs. And so one of the things that I find myself sort of bumping up against in this conversation is, I guess, the question that you asked, Colin, that I don't know that you proposed a framework or answer to, which is sort of like, if we acknowledge the fact that there's some research that we think is of high utility and we are not going to not do it, and we have to kind of do it we have to do it with animals. It has to involve animals in some way. You know, do you have a framework for sort of how we evaluate that utility or that need for the research or the knowledge with I guess an applied, something that's relatively well applied, and wouldn't feel quite so sort of ad hoc a little bit, I don't know. Do you know what I'm asking? Like, is there a way to really tease this out? Is there a line in the sand where we're like, this is good and we're going to do it, and it's okay if it involves beagles who are like lovable and, won Westminster 3 years ago? Or, are we going to be like, sorry, like people die, but we can't do this?
Um,
Did I emote well enough?
yeah, that was a great that was a great
Thank you.
emoting.
Thank you.
I so let's see. I think that the moral calculation that comes out of how I've presented the research in today's talk would suggest that the concerns would be then, just like with humans, limiting the amount of distress caused to the animal. I think there's a lot of animal rights folks who think that vegetarianism is necessary now because the practice of industrial farming is mutually exclusive with the good life and good death of the animals, but would cease to be vegetarian if the world were structured differently. And so in that sense, I think it would be very reasonable to conclude that there are both good and bad experiments with beagles. I've spent time in beagle labs, and they are distressing and interesting. It does also get to another one of my prompts for reflection, number 4, about the transparency and public trust, because I think a lot of, especially even just the way that you guys have phrased this as emoting, and the cuteness or winning Westminster of a beagle versus like maybe a chicken, especially a chicken that's been factory farmed and has lost a lot of its feathers, not as cute. Maybe you don't feel the same kind of affective resonance with that animal. Um, and it is interesting because I forget now off the top of my head who it was, but I think it was even a presidential candidate a couple of years ago who had been at Columbia. Maybe you guys will remember this as I'm talking, but had been at Columbia, had been doing medical research, I'm pretty sure with beagles. And I don't think he was ever sanctioned for what he was doing because I think largely the research was considered appropriate relative to the IACUC. But because it came out in public and because he was being attacked politically, um, it became like a major source of distress for the public. And I think that also probably has to play in some way into a calculation of the rectitude of animal research as well. I also think it's really interesting to consider the correlate of that question, which is if the concern is so great then that we feel like we can't let the public know what's happening behind the closed doors of the lab, what does that suggest about our relationship to the animals and to other systems of morality that are dominant in our communities?
Yeah.
Hey,
Jeff,
go
ahead,
last
Nick.
question if there's time.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
So one of the trends that we've discussed is our what was the term that you used? Our easier affection for animals that are more similar to humans. And to what extent will that have an impact going forwards? We've said, okay, animals such as dogs and cats are more protected because we have greater feelings for them. Is there a trend of people becoming more accepting of other considerations, or would you say that we're receding so that there's fewer things within our field of view for this consideration, or is it not necessarily the primary driver of ethical protections for animals?
So it's another great question. I remember maybe a decade ago, PETA came out with a program trying to, uh, I mean, I guess maybe most practically, most proximately cut back on overfishing, but ultimately also trying to get people to stop eating fish. And they proposed changing the word of fish to sea kittens, I think was the idea. Getting like pointing again, both to the idea that some of this is obviously more rhetorical than academic in terms of their campaigns, but also getting to the idea that there is a clear sense that the cuter an animal appears, the more likely it's going to be this source seen as a source of moral obligations. I do think another kind of going back to my anthro background, another thing that's interesting and important though is I don't think that this is an easy translation from we find the animals that are most closely related to us, like chimps, orangutans, whatever. They're the first things that get protections. The things that are most animals that are most behaviorally similar to us, so like elephants or cetaceans, and they're the first ones. I don't know that that will be the case. It certainly hasn't been the case. There's been a lot, again, also going back to Professor Hartzog's comment about the like, if you're a whale, you will not be used in medical research, but you could, up until very recently, be like captured in the wild, taken from your family, moved into a SeaWorld. Um, but there's some really interesting work in anthropology about cross-cultural animal taboos as foodstuffs. And it's very much the case that it is not so obvious um, that there aren't these clear like physical features, behavioral features that make an animal more or less available as food. So you can think, for instance, that I think a great example is like a horse versus a cow. They're both seen as farm animals, especially at this stage. We have very similar relationships to both of them. But in the United States, you're certainly not going to find horse meat at your local grocers, whereas you are absolutely going to find beef. In Germany, it's going to be different. You're going to be able to find horse meat, even then again, you don't really think about German culture as that different from American culture. So there's a lot of historical contingency to this that I think means that I do not expect this to move smoothly like up and down the evolutionary tree.
Well, as the convener, I'll take my responsibility seriously to end this the way I did not end my panel at this last conference we went over, and it was a disaster. But anyway, so thank you. I'm gonna call you Colin. I'm gonna call you Dr. Schwartz. Colin,
Sure.
Dr. Halverson for this wonderful discussion. I'm gonna say completely not a treats talk because it's not a short introduction to the basic topic. It is a deep and fascinating topic, and you've made me see that even more today than I thought before. Really exciting and fascinating area for us to try to help researchers move forward ethically in their translational research. Just wonderful. Thank you so much, Colin.
Thank you for